All right. That didn't have quite the energy I wanted, but it was still pretty good. I think that was the
I liked it.
Rome, Rome Total War intro music, which I thought was suitably strategic and the right kind of uh, sort of level of what I was going for this episode.
You took a shot?
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, how are you, Jeff?
I'm good. I thought you were going to have a smooth transition from that into today's topic.
I do. Well, yeah. I could have. I should have thought of. I should have thought of something. Well, it's today's the map game equivalent of an episode, of one of our episodes, because I'm going to be talking about sort of one of the min-maxing strategies for any would-be global ruler. How can you take over the world? How do you do it the most efficient way? And there are different runs. Different people have tried to take, and today we're going to look at one of them, which is going to segue nicely into the next episode, which I'm going to be talking about a new book by a guy named Peter Apps, which is called Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. And Apps is very biased towards NATO, but I thought that this would be a really interesting thing to look at this week before we look at NATO, because I think it kind of lines up why NATO does the stuff that it does. Particularly, why is America involved with NATO? There's some stuff that's been kicking off around Trump's sort of talking about, well, the Europeans, they don't pay enough. Nobody pays enough. Only we pay enough. And that sort of stuff, and trying to light a fire under NATO's ass, which I fully understand why America is doing it, because Europeans, in terms of resources, don't put in the same amount as the Americans do. But why? Well, I assure you, America is not involved in NATO for altruistic reasons. America is involved with NATO because it is in America's strategic interest to prevent a single power coming to dominate Europe. Now, why is that the case? Well, without getting into details of history since the end of 1945, NATO's formed in 1949, for the record, but not to get into that stuff, because that's what we're going to look at next week. Today I'm going to try and create a framework in which you can look at that and go, oh, I see why it's in America's interest to deny a Eurasian superstate from forming, which is what nearly happened during the Cold War. And this is something I've been meaning to do for like a long time. I've been talking to Jeff about this guy, Halford Mackinder, and exploring his thing. It's called the Heartland Theory. But I finally pulled my finger out and got to it. I read the two academic articles he writes. He's involved with the Royal Geographic Society. Here he is, Halford Mackinder. Very Victorian, late Victorian. And he writes the Heartland, the geographical pivot of history in 1904. He then expands it in 1919 in a book that I'm reading called, I think it's like Democracy and Reality, something like that. And that's very interesting. And I think in doing these sorts of the stuff that I've been doing, I'm sort of doing a like trace. I'm finding connections that link guys together. And I'm pretty sure Quigley must have known about Mackinder. I'm certain he did know about Mackinder because Quigley was a geography guy. A geographer.
I feel like some of this stuff also provides a counterpoint to kind of the people who always critique America for spending money overseas in overseas wars.
Oh, absolutely. And look, Iraq, okay, that's one thing. Defending Europe from the Soviets, that makes a lot more sense. And when people complain about, well, the Europeans aren't paying enough, you know what I'm hearing? What I hear? Let me translate that for you. That's Americans going, wow, empire is expensive. Welcome to the club, guys. Welcome to the club. The British did this. The French did this. The Germans did this. The Swedes did this. The Belgians did this. The Russians did this. This is what it's called being a great power. You have vassal states, and you've got to provide for them because if the vassals you better get strategic vassals. And let me tell you what, Western Europe is a pretty strategic vassal. But there's a quid pro quo there. You don't just get to people. It's a bit like the people's idea of what a king is in America. Well, the king's this guy who comes into my house and he tells me what to do and he kicks the door down and takes my money and leaves. Well, yeah, great, buddy. What else does the king do? Well, he administers law, courts, and justice, and he defends the realm, and basically, I think the European concept of king is more or less like the enforcer of a monarchist state. Monarchism being the most minimal state possible, which is basically you defend the borders and you enforce contracts, and you punish criminal behavior, right? That's what the king does. Americans can't get their minds around that, but anyway, and so empire is like that too, right? You don't just get vassals. You got to keep the vassals in line. You got to do stuff for them, and there's a quid pro quo in order to base your nuclear missiles in your vassal's territory. I can pull up. I won't today, unless Jeff thinks it's a good reminder. I can pull up the map about Titan and Jupiter missiles stationed in Europe in the late 50s, early 60s. That's the benefit of having Western European vassals. It gives, amongst other things, it gives America increased strike capability against the Soviets. And the minute the Soviets try to acquire something similar in Cuba, the Americans kick up a lot of shit because it's a one-way street. Anyway, this is what we're talking about today. How did I get on? There's stuff going around about NATO and the cost, the disproportionate spending by Americans compared to, basically the only countries that exceed America in percentage of GDP, not exceed America. There's only one country that's exceeded America in GDP expenditure on defense in the past few years, and that's Greece. And that's because the Greeks are fucking terrified of the Turks. The only other country, and that's a temporary spending splurge as well. I don't think that's sustained. The only countries that are consistently above 2%, I believe, are Britain and Poland and Greece. So everybody else, a couple of years ago, Merkel went to Trump when Trump's first term, and she said, "Well, Herr Trump, I think you should consider humanitarian aid as part of our spending on defense because it, prevents conflicts worldwide." And Trump was like, no, Merkel. Trump said Merkel was everything he hated about politics, which is a great line. Anyway, this is Halford Mackinder. He's the guy that comes up with this. He calls it the Heartland Theory. And I'm pretty sure Also downstream from Mackinder is Dugin. I'm pretty sure Dugin bases his Eurasianism off of the idea that Mackinder forms here. Mackinder is British, and basically this is a story about how the Anglos mess up every Eurasian empire because it's in our interests to mess it up. But before I do that, Jeff, tell me if there's something to say. Jeff, is there anything going on? No. The Mackinder is a geography, right? What's geography? Geography is not that common in America as a study. And this is because I read once that it got very tied up with coming up with race-based explanations, particularly American geography. And so it became very unpopular after the Civil Rights Movement. Geography is a really interesting thing to try and define. And in some ways, it's like the physical equivalent of philosophy. Whereas you can look here, you've got techniques here which I don't know anything about, human geography and physical geography, and here you have biogeography, and biology. So basically, geography is the way that different sorts of topics that have their own fields of study interact with the landscape and the environment and produce certain phenomena. So you have biogeography, which is about how biology interacts with its landscape, and you can do that both as a biologist and as a geographer. Now, in philosophy, there's something really similar in that, you've got biology and you've got philosophy of biology, and they're not the same, but you go far enough down biology and you're starting to do philosophy of biology. That's just an example. That's true of everything, right? You've got down here political geography and political science. Well, you also have political philosophy. And this is not me defending philosophy. I'm just trying to give you a way of making a parallel in your head with geography and philosophy, and how they seem to be the two subjects that are able to sort of just stick their nose into anything and go, oh, what's going on here? But you see, there's economic geography, and then on the other side there's economics. So this is a nice graph because it shows you the way in which these two sorts of a dedicated field of study and the geography perspective meet. And Mackinder writes an essay in the 1880s, it's 1887, called The Scope and Methods of Geography, in which he talks a lot about this, because in the 1880s you've got the situation where basically the whole world has been discovered except for the poles. And I don't mean Poland. I mean the North and South Pole. And so Mackinder is starting to think, and a lot of guys are starting to think, well, what do we do with geography now? Where do we go with this field of study? And the idea is, well, rather than just trying to become some survey, some science of surveying the land, cartography, we've got an opportunity here to, as I've said, look at the way man interacts with his environment. And so what you do is the two great fields of geography are physical geography and human geography. And what you need to first do is come up with a physical geography that you can then place man into and look at how the physical geography creates what Mackinder calls political geography, what I'm calling but you could also call that history or but it's basically human geography. And Mackinder gives this line, it should trace the interaction of man in society and so much of his environment as varies locally. Right? You don't really need to get into like what impact oxygen has on man in a geographic explanation, because oxygen is the same pretty much worldwide, right? Like, okay, there are certain places with bad air quality, but oxygen is oxygen. You don't need to talk about like the consumption of calories in a geography perspective. You can talk about the difference of foods, but you're looking at the variations. You don't need to look at the similarities, the universals, because the universals are constant. So Mackinder wants to like look at the variations. And so again, as I say, this begins with an analysis of the environment, and he's trying to come up with some sort of causal science of history and civilization. Something a lot of these guys try to do. A lot of them are trying to come up with some sort of model that can be applied to history. Now, why should we be a little bit wary of this? Well, that's very Marxist. The attempt to create models, to make humanity subjects into sciences, is very, very Marxist. So one of the ways I heard this described once, I can't remember who said it, it's years ago now, but it was someone saying like basically it's a sign of our Marxist decline that we have schools of political science, right? Like in university you'll have like a school of political science instead of a school of government. Because the idea is, well, you can apply scientific principles to government. Can you? I don't know. And I don't want to get too far into that, but basically I'm telling you, social science is fundamentally a Marxist endeavor, because the idea is there's predictability and the application of science. I don't think history is a science. I think history is what we would have called a humanities or an arts subject. Philosophy is not a science. I don't think government's a science. I don't think law is a science. These things are not open to the hard, cold rationality analysis that science is trying to do. But anyway, that's my opinion. Mackinder is trying to make a science out of history insofar as history is shaped by geography.
It's kind of like saying, is there a science to parenting? I mean, in some sense, there are certain things that can be applied broadly to all parenting situations, but at the end of the day, parenting is not a science, right?
Right.
It is each parenting situation is unique and personal.
And because you'll often hear like, oh, well, I did this. They say you got to do this. You got to do this with your kid. Well, yeah, but at 4 a.m. when they're screaming their heads off, maybe you should go cuddle them or something, right? Like, it's very easy to sit there dispassionately quoting stuff. There's no what it is it's against universalism, and it's for what in philosophy we call nominalism, which is like you can't generalize. Every kid you got these guides, but every kid has to be dealt with on their own terms. Mm-hmm. So to give you an example of this sort of like geography, this here is the northeast corner of India, and you can see that there's fairly limited entryways into India. And what a lot of invaders do is they sort of get through they've got to get through these mountains, and they've got to get up to where it says Indus River, because this is the highway down. You got to get down this plain between what's called the Thar Desert and between the Himalayas, and this is how you invade. Conversely, Mackinder describes like you've got New Delhi up here, and you've got Bengal in the sort of down here, the Bay of Bengal, which is what the British used to enter India, diagonally opposite, and so history has sort of dictated, or geography has sort of dictated the way in which historical events have happened, right? Alexander's invasion of India, the various invasions of India by like the Mughals, by the British. They're all dictated to by geography, and we're not going to be changing our geography anytime soon, and certainly it's been outside of our power to significantly change our geography in a geostrategic sense. The Chinese are trying to do that with building some islands in the middle of the Pacific, but that's a bit of a, at least thus far, we've been unable to significantly change the Earth's surface for these purposes. So these are sort of fixed constants. And it's certainly, the Earth has been its current layout since before man was on the scene, if it ever changed, depending upon who you ask. But it produces, it has distinct markers on events and the cultures that it produces. And I just, thought I'd put Machu Picchu here just because I think it's a very good example of, these people molding themselves around their environment, and yeah, that is the scope and methods of geography's first paper. I just wanted to give a little overview of what it actually means and where Mackinder's coming from. What Mackinder is known for, though, is what's called the Heartland theory. Now, before you really get into that, with a lot of maps today, guys. I hope you like maps. The Paradox players will be happy. You see, I got a couple here. This is, you can see you've got two great plains. You've got the European plain in the west here, and then you've got the sort of steppes, the Siberian plain up here, and the steppes are sort of down here. This map also shows the sort of the elevations. You got this the Ural Mountains, right? So lots of guys come down this path. They skirt the Ural Mountains to the south by the Sea of Azov, which is down there. This is the steppe proper, right? The extent of the steppes. I don't know why they included that bit in Turkey there. And so Mackinder, to start this analysis off, Mackinder says that for a long time, before the Europeans can really get control of history, this is my characterization, they have to deal constantly with these invasions coming out of the steppe, coming out of the east, and invading Europe. Now, if you go back to some of the one-off episodes that we've done on Quigley, on the evolution of civilizations, if you look at the one I did, the first one I did, the invasion of horse riding peoples pre-exists civilization, right? I'm not talking about them today, but the Scythians, right? The Scythians largely occupied this area, and the Scythians are a huge headache for the Persians down here, and the Persian, and they're the cousins of the Persians. They're the Persians that didn't settle down, but so and the Yamnaya, but you may want to call it the Aryan, the Bell Beaker. They're all steppe horsemen who show up. So in many and you are most likely the descendant of steppe horsemen that settled down in Europe at some point, and your ancestors maybe went to the New World or something. But this is what we're talking about, this sort of area, and history, Mackinder says, pivots around this because this area, because once the horse tribes are able to be countered, then the pivot moves westward, but it's about control of this pivot area, and the pivot can move, but the pivot is always in this Eurasian landmass, in this x-axis here, and we're gonna look at them. So, but the first real one that's worth talking about, though, is the Huns, and this is a fresco of the Battle of Chalon. It's also known as the Battle of Catalonia Plains in the north, 451, when the Romans beat the Huns. I think they beat the Huns. But what Mackinder says, one of the things that comes out of these waves, one of the things that comes out of dominating your enemies, that's also sort of lurking beneath this theory of his, is that external pressure creates nations. And one of the things that happens as a result of the Battle of Chalon, it's this like alliance of like Franks and Romans. And it really begins to form the Frankish identity, which is going to become the French identity. So there's a sort of game theory problem, which it's really interesting, and I don't know how to describe it in too much detail because it's something that I've been thinking about for the past week since I've been reading this stuff, which is if you're going to create an empire, if you're going to be really powerful, you got to not be so powerful that you create a resistance. And so if you're going to play the game, you can't be too good at it, because if you're too good at it, you'll form resistance and people will jump on you. It's a little bit like Risk, right? You never want to be the guy who begins to dominate too early in Risk, because what happens? Everybody attacks you. You got to be the guy who's drifting behind the best player. Anyway, this is the Huns. The pressure that these Eastern horse invaders create begins to create distinct European identities in the resistance to them. You'll also find this in the Caucasus. The resistance against these invaders is one of the reasons why the Caucasus have extremely strong tribal identities and national identities. The Huns are followed up by the Avars, who I was not able to find a super good map of the Avars, but this is more or less the extent of their empire, and you can see that
we have a time period for the previous map and this map.
Yeah, so the previous map is 451. I do have the time periods here. Give me 1 second. So the Avars are like 6th, 7th, 8th century. They sort of the 700s, right? 600s, 700s. And then these guys, the next guys are not super Dark of the Dark. The Hun Empire did not exist after the Romans. The Hun Empire smashes into the Roman Empire, and it's one of the reasons why the Western Roman Empire eventually falls, because the Western Roman Empire falls only 25 years after the Huns, and they're weakened, and so the Germanics move in. This is the Avars. These are the Gok Turks, which I hadn't really clocked into, but they're a similar timeline. And the thing to think about, they're the six. They're again. They're the same timeline as the Avars. These are the guys pushing the Avars, and this is what you got to remember with these horse tribesmen, right? The Huns are being pushed by the Avars, who are being pushed by the Gokturks, who are being pushed by etc. 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 And this is not an anthropology course on the successive waves, but I just want to put them in here. So don't ask me how the waves relate in detail. These are the Khazars, who you might all know from Ben Shapiro's sister. They're another horse tribe that come out of the Caucasus. Why are you laughing, Jeff? This is the Magyars.
We all kind of know why.
These are all. This is in chronological order, right? So the Khazars are like 6th to the 10th century, and then the Magyars show up, and you know what happens? Well, the Magyars displace their cousins, the Avars. So this is a recurring theme, right? The steppe tribesmen come out of the steppes and conquer or replace or bump along their cousins who were a generation before them. It's a really interesting kind of theme of history that I've discovered in the past few months. It's sort of like your real threat is your cousin, not anybody else. So the Magyars, who become the Hungarians, but the Magyars are being pushed by the Pechenegs, right? And so the Pechenegs are behind them, and you can see the Pechenegs sort of, they kind of leave the Khazars alone, and they bump the Magyars along. And at this time, you got the Bulgarians, right? The Bulgarians are not a horse tribe people in the same sense, but just to clue you in, like Byzantium has a massive problem with the Bulgarians. Eventually, the Bulgarians kind of become like their shield, but for a long time, they're like there's a Byzantine emperor who's like, his name's like the Bulgar Slayer. That's like the moniker they give him. Here are these guys. Let me look at my notes. These are the Cumans, and the Cumans are important, as we'll see in a few slides. Again, don't ask me too much about the Cumans. But now we're starting to get to the big dog, the Mongols. And you can see the extent of the Mongol Empire here, which is, amazing, right? Like, it's the largest land empire ever, the largest population empires, the British Empire as a percentage of the globe, and the Mongols, we have problems with them in Russia, and they're not too nice in China. But what they do to Iran is insane. They kill huge numbers of people in Iran. So much so that I think climatologists can see the particles of decaying Iranians in the ice core sample. There's some crazy you can see the carbon output declining because Iran gets so depopulated for generations because of the Mongol invasion. They're quite harsh. They're quite harsh. But good old Poland and the Balkans and Austria, that part of the world, they kind of lose steam there. But this is probably the closest that ever gets to what a global empire, a Eurasian empire. And because you can see, one of the things the Mongols tried to do is the Mongols tried to invade Japan. And kamikaze, the term kamikaze, comes from when the Mongol fleet tries to invade Japan and a divine wind destroys it. And this is the thing that you have to understand about Mackinder's theory. when a Eurasian empire is unopposed on land, it will then turn its attention to building a navy. The biggest thing about being on the Eurasian landmass is you have to have a army, because everybody, you live with neighbors, right? Britain can have a navy because it can put its resources into a navy. France can't have the same level of dedication to navy because France has to guard a border with, just using today's geography, right? A border with Belgium, a border with, if you're going to count them, Luxembourg, a border with Germany, a border with Switzerland, a border with Italy, and a border with Spain. And again, if you're going to count them, a border with Monaco and a border with Andorra. Well, the British don't have that problem, especially once they, beat, what's the way to put this? Get the Scots into line. Once the Scots are on board, and the Scots are massively on board with the British project, they're the ones that want Britain to begin with. You can commit yourself to a navy in a way that the French can't, and that's one of the reasons why the British dominate the seas, because they are an island. But it's not just, we're an island. We're an island that doesn't have any conflicts to worry about, and we can unify our island. So the Japanese get lucky. Huge that fleet gets destroyed. Anyway, what happens is it gets broken up into the four Khanates. And I want you guys to pay attention to this one, the Golden Horde. Because the Golden Horde, along with the Mongols earlier, subjugate the Kievan Rus. Right? Here we have the Kievan Rus. The purple is the Golden Horde, and the Russian principalities are in the green. And this is sort of the moment. It's sort of like around the 13th century, the tide is starting to turn. Well, why is the tide starting to turn? Because Europe is beginning to so significantly outpace all of its competitors in terms of technology. So there are things that alter the calculus of this sort of this geographic equation, and it would be wrong for you to listen to this and think, so it's old geography. No, that's not what I'm saying. Technology is a big part of it. And one of the things that people say in response to Mackinder's theory today is, well, Mackinder didn't take into account air power. Mackinder didn't take into account ICBMs. You can make that argument, but I think it's wrong. I think Mackinder's idea still holds. It just sort of negates some of the logistical things that Mackinder might have been thinking about. Now we can... Okay, you've got this little brief history, and we're going to come back to history. But I've given you some history. Now we're going to introduce some of the theory. You can see here why the extent of the Mongol Empire was what it was. And why a lot of these empires never really break that far into Europe. They often get to Hungary and then kind of peter out. The Mongols get quite a ways in. This is quite an achievement on the Mongols' part, this penetration into Europe. The Avars don't have the same sort of penetration. But the Huns do a pretty good job. And that's because these are horsemen. And they're very dependent upon flat, open land. Them trying to dominate... so it was a really obvious strategic choice for them to make... the Kievan Rus into vassals. Novgorod, I don't think is ever quelled by the Mongols, and you have this sort of this triangular thing: Novgorod versus Kiev, and then Kiev. I can't remember the details of Kiev, but Kiev becomes the Muscovites, and then there's this sort of power play between Muscovy and Novgorod, and eventually Muscovy wins out and absorbs Novgorod into it. But the reason why they don't try to conquer Russia, but are happy to have vassal states, is they know we can't really go into the forest and marshes that effectively. Now, they do quite a bit of awful stuff to the Russians. They are able to punish them when they rebel. There's a rebellion, and the boyars rebel against the Mongol rule, and the Mongols, like, basically, they put them underneath. They line up, like, hundreds of boyars, and then they build a dance hall over them. They just, like, lay wooden planks over the boyars. So the boyar, and then the Mongols have a dance, so the boyars just get squashed to death underneath hundreds of dancing Mongols. There's some story like that, right? But it's geography, right? The limit of the ability of the Mongols to press their advantage is dictated to them by geography. They've got an amazing strategy, tactics, technology with the horse and the bow that can dominate the steppes. But the minute you start to get out of the steppes, well, you're in our house. And you can see the way this breaks, right? Like, there's just this natural geographic boundary here between the Russians and the earlier empire, the Cumans. And that lines up really nicely with this one with the steppes and the forests and the marshes. Now, one of the things that starts to turn the tide for the Russians is their ability to clear forests and drain marshes starts to increase, and they're able to support a growing population on these lands. And so they can, and with a bigger population, they've got a bigger military. This again, you can sort of see how the way this geography breaks down rather nicely with the steppe again. Here you go. This stuff is limited by the geography, but there's a couple of empires that come up after these that Mackinder is not thinking about, because Mackinder writes in 1904, and so his application of these ideas is limited. But he says, well, the Russians trying to conquer Crimea in the 1850s, the French and the British intervened in order to prevent Russia getting too much of a stronghold on Eurasia. Likewise, the British were resisting Russia in Central Asia during what's called the Great Game in the 19th century, because if Russia ever gets a port on the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean, a lot of guys think it's sort of like game over. And some people out there think that's still Putin's ambition. I think it's crazy. I don't think Russia is really to worry about, but anymore. And I'll say more about that later. But so, and the idea is, if you look at Anglo history, this is where you either go, I love these English bastards, or I hate them. British, English geostrategy has, for about 500 years, been divide and conquer on the continent. You can't let anyone get too powerful, and when number one is getting too powerful, you side with number two. And it's why the British are pragmatic enough to ally with the Prussians, and then against the French. And then when the Prussians are getting too powerful, the French against the Prussians. We allied with the French against the Russians in the 1850s. We'll ally with anybody at the end of the day. Cromwell allies with Louis XIV at one point. Didn't see that one coming, right? The ultra Puritan sides with a very, very Catholic monarch. The British have invested because we're the naval power. And if you let anyone unify, and focus on a navy on the continent, it's game over for Britain, which is the main reason why Britain got involved in the First World War, as far as I'm concerned. Because the Kaiser was an idiot, and he had too many British cousins that he was jealous of with a big navy, and he wanted a big navy, and he didn't stay in his lane, which was dominate the continent. And so he starts to build a big navy, and the British are like, oh no. I skipped the slide here. So here you can see so the Russians about 1500 start to turn the tide, and Moscow comes out of this sort of rather, it's still probably bigger than England, right? This bit here, and they take up a lot of northwestern Russia, and then they start to expand, and they pick up these bits. Most of this is taken before 1700, and yeah, they put together an empire in 300 years, and they're a contender for the global empire now, the Eurasian Empire. And as I say, they're going to come back, but the one that the one that first really gets the British scared is Napoleon, because Napoleon controls here in this map, I would venture to estimate 50% of the global economy of that age. And Napoleon's great error, you might say error, although maybe he realized that he had to do this, was I've got to invade Russia. So he invades Russia, and his army gets, wiped out in the Russian winter. But he didn't need to invade Russia. But the British the British open up this front in Portugal in order to deter Napoleon being able to focus all of his attention on Russia. Classic British move is death by 1,000 cuts. Open up lots of little fronts everywhere. In the Second World War, it's North Africa, and it's Greece, and it's Norway, and it's raiding the French coast, and it's stuff like that, because the British have an advantage in maneuverability, and they can tie down more troops than they're going to use in tying those troops down. So very, very common British tactic there. Now, the way, again, back to theory, what happens is this shaded area is the drainage, as I understand it, of this area, and it all goes north. So the great advantage that this northern Eurasian landmass has is that there's nothing to its south, really, and there's nothing to its north. So it's able to punch west and east without any sort of worry about its northern and southern flanks. Certainly its northern flank, but less its southern. And this then becomes the pivot area, right? That mass that the Russian Empire controls in 1800, the mass that Napoleon's trying to push into. The thing about the Napoleon and the Russians, though, is they're not unopposed. They're worrying about one another. And had one of them not been there, they would have started to get too powerful. Here you can see this in slightly clearer terms. You have the pivot area, and the pivot area can move, as I say, it can move westwards. And in fact, Mackinder speculates that potentially in 1904, it could be China, right? Or, sorry, Japan. Japan could conquer China and then take significant portions of Siberia in order to make Japan the global empire. So it's not impossible for a nation outside of this area to become the global empire. And so you've got this pivot area, you've got the inner crescent, and so he says somewhere like India is functionally an island, but you've got the island layers, and the island nations. India's an island, Japan's an island, Britain's an island, and of course, Australia, the Americas are islands, and so he calls this the heartland, and he's got a little saying that it's like, he who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland, he who controls the heartland controls Eurasia, and he who controls Eurasia controls the world. So again, it's in the vested interest of these other powers, these outer powers, to prevent one power getting too powerful in that pivot area, in order to control, in order to try and become the global empire. Here's another attempt that I think you can describe as, and this is, of course, now we're after Mackinder. This is the extent of the Eastern Front. This is the First World War in April 1918. Don't really worry about anything else. What I want you to look at is this. And there's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Russian Empire gives over a huge amount of land to Germany and Austria-Hungary, and gives over a bit of land down here to the Ottomans, Armenia. But, and here we are, they get Ukraine. And I suspect if you had Mackinder here to ask him, what he would say is, it's not, okay, Eastern Europe controls Eurasia. But what controls Eastern Europe? I think he would say it's Ukraine. Now, that I'll talk a bit more about that next episode. But the acquisition of Ukraine is pretty huge, and one of the things the Allies do at Versailles is they invalidate Brest-Litovsk. They go, no, Brest-Litovsk is, we're not doing that. You're not keeping that land, and that pisses the Russians off. Because if I remember correctly, the Russians don't get the land back. This is like the basis of a bunch of new countries. I think they do get Ukraine back. I can't remember. I should know that. Here's another attempt. Here's another moment when things are on the knife's edge, right? This is the greatest extent of Nazi Germany, right? And again, they take Ukraine, very, very significant crossroads of Eurasia, Ukraine. They nearly reach Astrakhan here, right? The three moments are Stalingrad, Moscow, and St. Petersburg or Leningrad. Yeah, not to go too deep into World War II strategy, but that's that sort of line. The Russians just managed to hold this line, and it was really like if the Germans could have broken one of those pieces, I think Russia would have crumbled away. And Soviet Union again. It's a massive empire that's united. This is the Warsaw Pact, of course, not the Soviet Union. You got Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany. You have Albania, kind of. Yugoslavia does its own thing because Stalin and Tito don't get along. Austria is neutral. Finland and Sweden are neutral. And, of course, they're not anymore. They're in NATO as of... Sweden's in NATO as of like a week ago or something like that. You've kind of got China on the other side, but and here you can see this the Soviet Union overlapping with the heartland theory, you can see that, they really are coming close to accomplishing what Mackinder says. Now, unfortunately for the Soviet Union, and unfortunately for all of these would-be global powers, they have not accounted for this theory. There's one thing that remains elusive from their grasp, which is I should have put this in, but let's have a go here. Save. The thing that they're not able to get access to that lies outside of the steppe region is this area. And this is called the Blue Banana. And the Blue Banana is, until the appearance of America, the Blue Banana is the most economically productive part of the world. And it is a combination of places that are incredibly skilled in their ability to produce, they're very skilled in their ability to trade, and they're very skilled in, or they have very advantageous geographic position, and it's very difficult to have to control them by a single power because they're quite unruly. So Russia at the end of the Second World War, East Germany, it's very agrarian. Russia doesn't get the productive part of West Germany. It's called the Ruhr, right? The area of the Rhine. It doesn't get Italy. It doesn't northern Italy. It doesn't get Switzerland. It doesn't get Belgium and Holland and Alsace-Lorraine. And so there's this interesting sort of built-in hurdle in the game that nobody's been able to achieve yet, which is putting together an empire in the homeland, in the pivot area, that is able to take this area. And I think that this is the deciding factor for a global empire, is to be able to do that and then take this area. Of course, the guy that comes closest to it is Mustache Man. And, you can speculate about what would have happened, but he probably, I know Hitler was pretty desperate to make peace with Britain because he realized the British were good at what they did. The British were very good at this sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And he could never fully devote himself to the invasion of the Soviet Union. He also had to keep Mussolini in line. He once said that, there's some... That having Mussolini on his side cost him 100 divisions because Mussolini was such an idiot. But that's the thing. I think if there's this interesting limitation on the inability for these steppe tribes to capture the Blue Banana, and of course, the Huns. When the Huns get as far as they do, that's really before the Blue Banana is what it is. Now, a number of people are still operating on this idea. How the hell do I say his name? Jeff, you know who I'm talking about. Brzezinski.
Yep.
How do I say his first name? This is big news.
This is a big news.
This is big news. This is big news. Brzezinski.
The big.
let's. I'll get a picture of him up. Here we go. He was a geostrategic guy, and he advocated in the mid '90s that the answer that American geostrategy should be focused on Central Asia, and he said that by focusing on Central Asia, we could really create this permanent permanent thorn in the side of Russia. He was very concerned with preventing the Soviet Union or anything like the Soviet Union reappearing, which sounds really weird, but my reading of this book by Peter Apps about NATO, they're really concerned with Russia they never stop being concerned about Russia. There's serious concerns about Russia during Kosovo. The Russians the Russians and NATO nearly start fighting again in '99 at NATO. I think it's the NATO commander is Clark. I don't know if it's Wesley Clark. He's what's called SACEUR, which is Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who's like the military head of NATO. And SACEUR gives an order to the British general to block the runway at this airport, which the Russians are apparently going to use to land planes. And orders start coming down the radio. And if you've ever heard about how what's his face, you're beautiful, you know that guy. Who's that guy? The singer, the pretty boy,
James Blunt.
James Blunt was, I believe at the time, was a captain. He might have just been a lieutenant in the Household Cavalry. And his unit was at the airport. And Blunt gets his command down the radio, like, "Oh, we'll destroy Russians." Oh. And Blunt's like, I don't think so, sir. And he sort of like, and so apparently there is a joke, not apparently, there is a joke that says James Blunt prevented World War III in 1999. Because he was like at the front of what would have been where it kicked off. They're very concerned with Russia for a very long time. Yeltsin has this big problem with Crimea. Yeltsin in like '94, maybe '95, says everybody's coming to him, going, all these Russian places are coming to him, going, all these USSR places are coming to him, going, we want independence, we want autonomy, we want to get away from you, we want to do this. And Yeltsin goes, I'm going to give them so much autonomy that they're not, I'm going to give them all the autonomy they can handle. And then like a few months later, Kazakhstan is too big to force in. But one of the things that happens is someone tiptoes into Yeltsin's office in like 94, 95 after he said this, and they go, by the way, Chechnya has a lot of oil. And Yeltsin goes, yeah, about that autonomy thing. And that's how the Chechen war starts, because the Russians go to the Chechens, sure, piss off, and then somebody goes, actually, there's a lot of money there, and the Russians go, actually, you're still part of us. And in fact, I think That's the who is it? Who is it? Somebody says that the Russian. It's like Dostoevsky's best book, or it might be Tolstoy. I can't remember, but like the best book of Russian literature is the book about the Chechens. There's some book, 19th century Russian literature book about the Chechens. So if you want to read that, I haven't read it. It's not very long. I don't think. I think it's one of the shorter ones. Anyway, I'm waffling a bit. So the idea, though, is Brzezinski's idea is like, well, you gotta. What one reviewer describes as full court press in his book The Grand Chessboard, where his attitude towards China is much more zone defense. So they're very aggressive about this. Now, I said a little bit earlier about China. I come back to China. And why we shouldn't worry about Russia, because my view is if you're going to start worrying about heartland stuff, you need to worry not so much. I think it's a bit of a misdirect to go to Ukraine and Russia, although I think it's very interesting, and I think the Russians appreciate this sort of grand strategy that Mackinder is describing here, and they realize the crossroads that Ukraine is, and that they can't let that crossroads fall. But it seems to me the NATO's okay with losing Ukraine because they never really had it. Because it appears to me, John Mearsheimer's right that the goal of the West, the unstated goal of the West, is to let Russia win as painfully as possible, and bleed Russia dry as much as they can. I think that the best way of looking at the Heartland theory today, though, is in light of Russia's economy is really bad. When you hear about the economic growth that Russia's achieving, if you want to look at this, you only have to go back to the Quigley episode on the military-industrial complex that we did. We know that military spending is great for the economy in terms of GDP and line on the graph go up and that sort of stuff. It is not great for the people of the country in terms of their lifestyle and their wealth. And Russia is putting up some numbers, but it is woefully low on labor. I think it's like, I can't remember. There's huge numbers of vacancies in Russia because the best guys for that are also happen to be the best guys to go throw at Ukraine. Ukraine has the benefit of having the West behind it, and it doesn't have to build tanks. And so Russia has to build tanks and fight Ukraine. Thankfully, it outnumbers Ukrainians about 3-1. Thankfully for the Russian interests. What I think, sorry, I keep getting to this point. What I think the worry about is China, because China has become really good friends with Russia, and it is able to basically. My theory is that China is going to either unofficially or in some official capacity, via like temporary concessions or something like that, get more and more control over eastern Russia because Putin needs to make concessions to keep China on side. Now, to throw another little wrench in the work, I mean, of course, if you want to go down the road of Peter Zeihan, China is going to depopulate, so we shouldn't be that worried about China because they don't even need Siberia anymore. Khrushchev and Mao fought like a low-intensity border war over Siberia. To throw another wrench in the work of this Heartland theory, or it's not the theory, but of it being able to unite Iran. There's some really interesting news coming out of Iran in the last week or two. If you guys haven't been paying attention, it is very conceivable that in 10 to 20 years' time, Iran could flip back to being pro-West, because 72% of Iranians do not want a Shiite, a religious Islamic government. The Shiite majority is in sharp decline. Huge numbers are non-religious. Huge numbers are atheist. There's a growing Christian population, and interestingly, and I hate to say this as a Christian, but I kind of love this from like map game mode brain. There's a resurgent Zoroastrianism, and to give credit to them, my theory is that Zoroastrians are like a lost Abrahamic faith, so they're kind of like, I mean, they're kind of our guys. I don't know. I like to think of Zoroastrians as like Christians who are missing that piece of Christ, and give the devil a little bit too much power. But I'm drifting. Iran could flip, though, is the point. So what I'm saying to you is keep an eye on Iran. Iran could get very, very, very interesting over the next few years. The real worry, though, if you're really going to go deep on this, there's two areas of the globe that are demographically set to keep going really strong. One is sub-Saharan Africa, which is not really a threat to us in heartland theory terms. It's a threat in terms of demographics happening to developed nations. But India is shows no signs of demographically declining anytime soon, and India could come to control this area. But then the good news is that India doesn't have any friends. India only has very temporary allies, because it's really hard to be friends when you're the only member of your culture group. This, I'm sort of going to what's his face, Clash of Civilizations. I can't remember his name right now. Peter somethings. Anyway, India is the only one of its kind. It's not able to really create alliances, although they love Israel. But that's the heartland theory, and I think it's an interesting idea to keep in the back of our heads as we go into next week. We're going to look at NATO, and we're going to consider what I'm going to try and do with the NATO conversation is it's not about the heartland theory so much. It's about starting to develop a more sophisticated toolbox for analyzing history and events, and to say, oh, this could be the heartland theory, or oh, it could be this theory, or oh, it could be that theory. But we've now, when we look at NATO, we're going to have a nice tool to apply, a nice tool of analysis to apply to talking about NATO and why NATO is still there. And of course, right, like, what did I say at the beginning about America? America, if Mackinder is right, of course America has a vested interest in putting troops in Germany, because it is, if the Soviet Union had ever been able to take those blue bananas, then America is all of a sudden, you can't hide behind the Atlantic. If all of Eurasia falls to the Soviets, and they want to come for you, you can't hide behind the Atlantic. And the only recourse then is nuclear war. So in some ways, Western Europe, for Americans from the Mackinder point of view, Western Europe serves as a outer shell to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are only going to be used in certain circumstances, but you've got Western Europe, and really only, if you're an American, you really only have to worry about nuclear weapons until Western Europe falls. And this is one of the things I'll talk about with NATO, is like NATO is always very wary of American nuclear policy, because their view is Americans can be cavalier because there are actually fairly limited number of ICBMs that can reach America. There's a lot of medium and short range nuclear weaponry that can't reach America but can reach Paris. They can reach Frankfurt and Bonn and London and Milan and Rome. So all this starts to fold in. So anyway, that's the Heartland theory. I haven't been looking at chat. I've been pretty in the zone.
Yeah, not a lot going on in chat today, but
Okay.
but no idea does appear to be a big fan of Mackinder's theory. And he says that Heartland theory very much ties into Dugin's Eurasianism, also China's Belt and Road. Germany is vital for this, and USA must keep them in check.
Yeah. Germany. Okay, look. So we're in a really interesting, right, to be academic. I don't want to be pessimistic or optimistic. We're in a really interesting moment globally, because last year, the numbers came out a few weeks ago. Last year we hit, in 2023, global GDP was $100 trillion. And last year, global debt combined, this is national debt, hit $100 trillion. We are 1-to-1 debt to GDP ratio globally. Governments are increasingly going to be hit with a couple of choices: cutting services, increasing taxes, inflating their currency, or a combination of them, or default, although you really don't want to go down that road of default. Although, who owns the debt is a great question. And it's something I'm struggling to wrap my head around. But a lot of the people that own the debt are the boomers. But anyway, it would be really bad, apparently, if you just defaulted. So there's and this is on top of those considerations. This enormous mountain of debt is on top of the fact that the West is killing itself with two things. It's killing itself with its diversity, inclusion, and equity, and it's killing itself with an attempt to achieve net zero. Now, what does that look like for relevant to No Idea's point about Germany? Well, Germany is, for the second year in a row, the worst performing advanced economy in the world. And they have, I believe, their economy has had a recession of 2%. It has gotten smaller. Let me have a look here. So it's a bad moment. It's a bad moment. Okay, Germany didn't go into recession, but it did. I don't know. It depending upon who you look at. Germany went into recession or didn't go into recession, but it is the worst performing economy for 2 years in a row of the advanced economies. Now, Europe is at a crossroads. If Europe does not get its shit together, it is going to be poor for generations. It's going to be it's going to have no defense of the hordes of migrants flooding in, just as America. Um, and it's going to be permanently enslaved uh, uh, to outside power like America. If there's any hope, the European economies have to engage in a set of activities that will make Thatcher look like Stalin. We're going to have to get brutal with our economies if we want to survive the next 20 or 30 years in any way that resembles what we currently have. We're going to have to really overhaul things. And the same goes for Canada. The same goes for the U.S. as well, though. The thing I keep coming up against is we keep looking at geopolitics as a zero-sum game, right? Russia gains, will lose. Or China gains and will lose somehow with like Taiwan. What I'm realizing, and if there's a message to get across in terms of this sort of stuff from the stream, is we're not in a zero-sum game, we're in a negative-sum game. The next 100 years is a negative-sum environment. And that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be good because people will be inward-looking. No, in zero-sum situations, people get desperate and they start going, well, if it's a zero-sum game anyway, I can grab what my neighbor has and add it to my pile. It's a really precarious situation in terms of these nations, the national blocks, the ideological blocks. And I think, the sad thing is that the right leader could make the European Union into the best place in the world. They don't show any sign, though, of getting that guy. They've got Ursula von der Leyen, who is so bad and uninspiring. She makes Merkel look charismatic. They've got Guy Verhofstadt in the parliament, who's just a retard. If they went down the dark EU route, though, they could really become the best place in the world. I'm pretty confident of that. Peter Zeihan is very optimistic about America. The problem with Peter Zeihan's analysis of America is he treats Mexicans like they are like one-for-one replacement of Americans. So if European Americans stop having babies, that's all right because there's plenty of Central Americans that want to move here. Yeah, that's not how you keep the American Republic together, Peter. That's how you import, Guatemala into America. Where are the Guatemalan coders, right? I'm sure there are. There are some out there. Don't get me wrong, but I don't believe like Nicaraguans are going to be capable of the productivity that some fifth generation German guy is, who's really committed to the Republic, right? What they're going to do is they're going a huge drain on nation's wealth is remittances, right? Britain sends huge amounts of money to India. America sends huge amounts of money to Central America via people sending their pay back home. And it never comes north. It doesn't cycle back up north. And it's a drop in the bucket in terms of what these places need as well. It's a huge drain on us, and it doesn't make a big economic difference to them. But anyway, I'm going around, and I feel like I might be getting off the point. It's a crazy time. It's a really crazy moment. And understanding these sort of strategic motivations of entities like NATO, understanding how we got here, I think points towards something bigger. And once again, it's this question that Jeff and I go back and forth on, right? Like, how organized are the elite? Are there guys hiding behind the curtains that have been working a plan for the last 250 years? Or are they bumbling from crisis to crisis? Is it 8D chess, or are they barely pulling out checkers? Or tic-tac-toe? I don't know, and I go back and forth.
And I wonder if it could be possibly be an element of both. That they are going from crisis to crisis with a kind of loose 250-year plan.
The stuff that increasingly scares me is net zero. I'm really scared for the globe, for places like, I don't know. I'm trying to pick a country that is not too much of a caricature, but is like, obviously it would scare me. Like Ghana, right? Somewhere like Ghana building nuclear power plants because of like net zero policies being pushed on it by the UN. I think it's a lot less dangerous to let Ghana keep burning fossil fuels than to expect sub-Saharan African nations to run nuclear power plants. I think there's a lot less danger for the world in those situations. It's great for China. It's great for Russia. It's great for France. And it's not great for Britain because our government is shit and it can't see 3 weeks further than 3 weeks down the road. But like countries that like have some sort of time frame that they can operate in, sure. I don't like nuclear power, but I get it. Fine. But the idea that we're going to get nuclear power in New Guinea, right? New Guinea can't have nuclear power, right? I don't want, freaking, I don't know, Jesus, Ecuador to try and build a nuclear power plant. I want. So I'm really worried about net zero, and like, it's almost like Fallout, right? Like the only hope that I have is that like some tech brotherhood of Europeans and Asians forms to like go out to freaking Namibia and run their nuclear power plants for them unpaid, just because oh shit, we can't let the Namibians run a nuclear power plant. I'm really that's one of my major concerns. I'm really worried about these. We're killing ourselves. We're intentionally killing our economy for diversity and for some sort of ephemeral threat that may or may not be there. My view is, if it's real, we're a problem-solution oriented species. That's how we've dealt with everything. And the problem is, if the problem is carbon output, the solution is not going to be stopping carbon output, but creating some sort of technology to compensate for that, which scares the shit out of me too. Mm-hmm. I don't like the idea of Bill Gates putting space mirrors, but it's more appealing to me than shutting off the lights. Right, the great greening, right? The planet is greener than it's ever been before. I'm actually kind of optimistic about global warming for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's going to open up. Okay, here we go. Back to Heartland theory. This is one of the things I meant to say. Right? Spengler said that the last great civilization was going to be the Russian civilization. And the Heartland theory, when combined, and he said that the Russian civilization was going to save the West, and that which is really weird, and that the Russian civilization would like come to it would be the last civilization. Okay, how do we get there? Well, this is how I think we get there. Global warming happens, and Russia, Siberia, all of a sudden becomes incredibly fertile land because there's a lot of, from what I understand, the soil of Siberia is really fertile. It's just frozen. So the permafrost goes, and now this great span of what is now ice, that northern area, unlocks. And Russia now is able to grow enormous amounts of food. But not only grow enormous amounts of food, it has an incredible river system in Siberia. Let me see if I can... it's got an incredible river system. And as Peter Zeihan points out... I do like Peter Zeihan. I've already said, I disagree with him. Yeah, this one... These both are pretty nice picture maps. I love a good map, if you can't tell, which is why, do what you love. I love maps and talking, so that's why I stream and talk about, use a lot of maps. I don't know which one's better. This one's a bit... Now, here you go. Imagine Russia, northern Russia here, unfreezes, and you can start growing shit. Well, the other half of the equation is how do you get it anywhere? Well, imagine if all these rivers are flowing into a northern sea without ice that's navigable year round. Well, all of a sudden you're off to the races, and you're able to, feed huge numbers. Although we don't need to feed as many people. There's a really good theory that we've already peaked in terms of global population. It's never going to be as big. That we've already reached the most number of people that will ever be alive, at least given current projections. Who knows what will happen 1,000 years from now? And you've got some sort of like I've joked about it before, I think with Jeff, that you could have some sort of like Happa race of Siberians evolve shipping wheat out, and all of a sudden it's not Russia. It's not what Russia currently is. It's a new thing that happens in Russia. That would develop and go north. This is me being very schizo, I admit, very schizo, but it's the one way in which global warming could impact this stuff. But I'm really, when I think about it, I'm really optimistic about global warming because climatic change drives every great technological leap forward, and if there is something that happens in terms of our climate from in the next 20 or 30 years, it will necessitate a technological shift. And the other thing that will happen is it will stop us from being so inward looking. And it's this inward turn that is destroying the soul of the West by worrying about BLM and trans and all that shit. And an external pressure will get us back to doing what we need to do.
If I remember correctly, the Spenglerian analysis was that Russia never got a chance to kind of blossom into what it was, kind of blossom into a full civilization because it got stunted by communism. Right?
I don't know about that one because I don't think he talks about it in the decline of the West because the kind of the West is it's in one of his later things that he then backtracks on Russia, and he says, actually, I was wrong about Russia because of communism. I think he thinks that Russia has a chance before communism, but he then retracts his view that Russia would be the last civilization because of communism. Yeah. That's the Heartland theory and a bit of schizo posting.
Yeah.
So next week...
So tell us what you're going to talk about next week.
Yeah. Next week is NATO. Shouldn't read that. This isn't a bonus features episode. Bonus features are what I do on Friday. But Friday, actually, that's a good point. This Friday, I'll do the classical world from the classical civilization, which Quigley talks about in the evolution of civilizations, and then Tuesday or Wednesday next week, I will be doing this book by Peter Apps about NATO, and the significant things that I'm going to be talking about from that is, the first one is it's 1950 that Eisenhower gets called back. Eisenhower's got into retirement, and he gets called back, and he is the first sacker, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, for NATO, and he builds the NATO military structure. And it's during the 18 months that he's strategic Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and before he runs for president, he gets talked into running for president because of what he sees in these 18 months that he's back in Europe. But it's during these 18 months that he sees the immense cost that peace is going to require. He knew what war required because he was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe for 4 years. But I don't think when he leaves, I think he buys into the idea of, what's at the end of the Cold War, they call it the peace dividend. We're not going to have to spend any money on defense because the war's over. And then he realizes in 1950, oh man, we are going to have to put a lot of money into deterring the Soviets. And I think here is when he forms his ideas about the military-industrial complex. That's one. The other thing that's very significant about NATO, I've talked a little bit about it tonight, is the relationship that forms between Europe and America, and the way in which it becomes the American vassal states. Europe becomes American vassal states. But of course, that's not how it's sold to Americans. It's sold to Americans as our European partners who, brackets, have to do what they're told. So America frames NATO very much in terms of being able to have their cake and eat it too. But in doing so, they're never satisfied with the result, because it's always a disappointment because the Europeans never pay what the Americans think they ought to pay. Meanwhile, America's never fully honest about what it's getting out of NATO, which is an empire. It's dominating Western Europe. And then the other really interesting thing about NATO is what it does to the Balkans. The absolute pig's breakfast. Look, here's the thing about America. They're bad at empire. They are really, really bad at empire. They're great at power. They're great at controlling and conquering. They are bad at governing. It's why Afghanistan is a shithole. It's why Iraq is terrible. It's why everywhere America goes, they end up just messing it up. Because they have a naive view of the world, What they need is America needs to develop some sort of system where when it invades a country, it then just hands over imperial administration to the British or the French or the Spanish, who could just take their guys that have no jobs in Britain, and those guys can go be police officers in Sudan or something like that. Because America doesn't seem capable of running countries. And it's what's so damaging about the American empire, right? It's the shadow empire. It's the empire over the horizon. It's the empire that you never feel any of the benefits of, but only the negatives. So, and they really mess up the Balkans. They really mess up Serbia. Serbia really gets an unfair deal from the Americans, first in Bosnia, then in Kosovo, and the Albanians are a massive problem. The Albanians never get the attention they deserve because they're the ones messing everything up in Bosnia and Kosovo, and there's an Albanian insurgency in Macedonia that nearly draws a lot more attention. But fortunately for the Macedonians, September 11th happens, and the Albanians go, "Oh shit, we don't want we don't want to look like we have anything to do with Islamism," and so the Albanians pull their heads in and stop messing around in Macedonia. And of course, there's the stuff that then happens with Ukraine and the way the Americans encourage push the border. But Peter Apps, as I say, is very pro NATO. He's liberal, and it's going to be very much surface level stuff. There's some interesting stuff he's got in there, but it's an overview of NATO. It's very useful, and I think it's going to build really nicely on the Heartland theory. Anything else?
Oh, sounds good.
Cool. All right. I didn't think about exit music. What shall we have? I don't know. I can't think of anything to play. What should I play, Jeff?
Do you have anything Russian?
No. One of my friends once sent this band to me that was it was a Russian band, and it was like super new wave. It sounded like Morrissey or that sort of stuff, but I can't remember his name. And of course, it's all in Cyrillic. So let's see what. Why can't I play TV show music? Ugh. What should I do? What should I do?
Just give us Zangief.
All right. I'm paralyzed there. I'm gonna do this version, whichever this version is. All right. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you next time. Oh. Sorry, that's awful. That was like one of the modern versions for Zangief, and I'm just not gonna have it. Here's the old version.